So what is context? To put it simply, context is backstory, and backstory helps us understand how and why events or developments have taken place in history. You encounter context more than you probably think. Think about when you're watching your favorite TV show. Whenever there is a flashback scene, the creators of the show are trying to help you better understand how and why the characters in the show are in their current predicament. This is context. Let's look at a classic example from the 1990s. This TV show stars Will Smith, who was a teenager from West Philadelphia living in a mansion with his wealthy aunt and uncle in Bel-Air, which is a very upscale neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. If you've ever seen the show, it'll seem like Will is a little bit out of place while living in this new neighborhood. To better understand how and why Will's history has unfolded the way that it has, we have to examine the historical context. This is easy in this case, because as some of you may know, the show's theme song tells the backstory of how Will ended up in Bel-Air. Check out the link in the description below to hear the song for yourself, if you like. Now let's say that you were given an assignment in which you were asked to use the show's theme song in order to describe the context for Will's living in Bel-Air. When you are asked to describe the context for a particular moment in history, I would recommend asking yourself the following 3 questions. What took place in history around the same time or just prior to the event in question that caused the event in question? What took place in history around the same time or just prior to the event in question that made the event in question even possible? How did geography possibly play a role in influencing the event in history? Again, the event in question here is Will Smith living in Bel-Air. After listening to the song, you may come up with the following historical circumstances. Yes, I'm using 2 different words here interchangeably, context and circumstances. For our intents and purposes, you can use them synonymously. So, as described in the song, the historical circumstances contributing to Will's arrival in California were that West Philadelphia was a tough neighborhood, Will had a protective mother, Will got into a fight, and Will had an aunt and uncle who lived in Bel-Air. Context doesn't only consist of the direct causes for a particular event unfolding. For example, there were other developments that contributed to Will ending up in Bel-Air. Let's start with geography. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you already have basic knowledge of how geography can impact history, but we'll discuss this more in another video. One geographic fact that relates here is that Bel-Air is part of Los Angeles, which is on the coast of California. You might ask yourself how this relates to the story of Will Smith. Well, coastlines are typically areas of high population density due to the desire to take advantage of trade routes, and they can be centers of industry and job opportunities. This can help us explain why there was a desire for Americans, including Will's relatives, to live in Los Angeles. Another geographic factor that contributed to Will living in California was that gold deposits were found in California in 1848. This began the so-called gold rush out west, and yet again helps us explain why Americans ended up settling on the west coast of North America. When examining context, we can and should take into account broader historical developments. These are factors that did not necessarily cause an event to later unfold, but they certainly made that event even possible. One such broad historical development was that the US obtained the land that would eventually become the state of California after defeating Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Had this event not occurred, it's unlikely that Americans would have settled in this territory in such large numbers. Another broad historical development was that the US completed the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, linking the country together with high-speed transportation technology for the first time. Like the gold rush, this development fueled mass migration of Americans westward. Now, we don't want to go back too far when describing the context of a particular event. For example, when putting Will Smith's arrival in Bel-Air into context, we wouldn't want to use something like the Big Bang as an example of a development that made Will Smith's living in Bel-Air possible. I personally would recommend keeping within a time span of about 200 years. Referring back to the examples we already discussed, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, which was only 121 years before the debut of the TV show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. This may seem like a long time, but in the entire span of human history, 121 years is a tiny drop in the bucket. So to recap, context consists of historical circumstances, both direct and broad, as well as geographic circumstances. Now, let's say that this was an actual assignment, and your teacher proposed the following question. Explain the historical and/or geographic circumstances that led to Will Smith living in Bel-Air. How would you answer this question? While the Regents exam will generally allow you to respond with only one historical or geographic circumstance, I usually ask my students to provide two developments that would explain the event in question, which in this case is Will living in Bel-Air. We always want to respond using complete sentences. It might be helpful to use the following sentence starters. One historical development that led to the event in question was, and here's where you'll identify and briefly connect the development to the event in question, and then you'll just do the same thing again. So if we were to answer the question given to us, it might look something like this. One historical development that led to Will Smith living in Bel-Air was that West Philadelphia was a rough neighborhood, which led to Will's mother wanting him to live in a safer place. Another development that led to Will living in Bel-Air was that gold deposits were found in California in 1848. This led to a mass migration of Americans westward to what would become the US state of California. Notice how I didn't just state the development, but also briefly explained its connection to the event in question, which again is Will living in Bel-Air. That's all there is to it. Now let's apply what we've learned to the Regents exam itself. Let's look at the first Part 2 question from the January 2020 Regents exam. If you're interested in viewing this entire test, as well as its answer key, check out the link in the description below. Looking over old tests and examining what the state accepts as correct answers for the Part 2 section is a great way to study. The first question in the Part 2 is always going to ask you to provide context for a specific document by asking you to explain the historic and/or geographic circumstances. We already practiced doing that for Will Smith's arrival in Bel-Air. Now we have to do the same thing for a written primary source. In this case, the document is an excerpt from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. The first thing I recommend doing whenever analyzing a document is to try and determine the title of the document, who wrote the document, and when it was written. Maybe you already learned about the author and his or her ideas in class. If so, activating this prior knowledge might help you better make sense of what you are about to read. We can determine that John Locke wrote the document in 1690, and if you already learned about this individual in class, you should recall that John Locke supported ideas about democracy and that the government has a responsibility to protect what he called the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Let's see if the document reflects what we already know about John Locke. When I read the document, the following keywords jump out at me: free, equal, independent, consent, secure enjoyment of properties, and majority. These words absolutely reflect the ideas of John Locke that you should have already learned about. Take a look at this one sentence. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against any that are not of it. This is basically the social contract idea that other Enlightenment philosophers also discussed around the same time. The social contract concept is the idea that people willingly come together to form a government that may restrict some personal freedom for the purposes of creating a safe society that protects private property and one that offers personal security. For example, the government that the people form may restrict someone's ability to steal, but in return, people can take comfort in that their possessions are their own and likely won't be stolen. So our analysis of the document confirms that John Locke is discussing how people should only have to live under a government if it was created with their consent, which is the basic principle of democracy, and that this government should protect people's rights. Now that we know what the document is about, we have a better chance of accurately describing the historical circumstances. Remember, ask yourself the same questions that we discussed when describing the context for Will Smith's arrival in Bel-Air. The question is not asking about geography, so it would not be appropriate to offer geographic context in this case. This could be difficult, since the document does not provide this information for you. Your answer must come from the knowledge you already possess. I suggest brainstorming and writing down anything you can recall about the time period or just prior that might have caused or influenced John Locke to write this document. Here are some developments you may remember from class that likely contributed to John Locke writing this document. Absolute monarchies in Europe were abusing their political power by denying people basic rights. The scientific revolution led to people questioning traditions. And finally, Enlightenment thinkers applied reason and natural laws to support new political ideas. Now that we recalled some of the historical circumstances for John Locke's writing, all we have to do is put them into complete sentences. Remember, one development should be enough for the Regents exam, but your teacher may ask for 2 or more. We can use the same format that we used before. Pause the video here and see if you can complete these sentence frames on your own using 2 out of the 3 historical developments we recalled. When you're ready, unpause the video and compare your work to my own. Your answer should look something like this. One historical development that led to John Locke developing political ideas, such as those expressed in his second treatise of government, was that absolute monarchies in Europe were abusing their political power by denying people basic rights. John Locke believed in the concept of natural rights and wanted governments to protect them. Another development that led to John Locke developing his ideas was that the scientific revolution led to people questioning traditions. This contributed to people questioning the idea of divine right monarchies, which was a long-standing practice among kings. Notice the highlighted sentences. This is where I am connecting the historical circumstances directly to something shown or implied in the document. So that's going to do it for our discussion of context and how to apply your new knowledge to answering questions about historical and geographic circumstances in the Part 2 section of the Global History and Geography Regents. Don't be afraid to discuss context in other places as well. We'll be talking about the Enduring Issues essay more so in another video, but one of the key factors in getting a high grade on the essay is to include an abundance of outside information. Providing historical or geographic circumstances is a great way to bring in your outside knowledge. In the next few videos, we will discuss the second Part 2 question, which will ask you to analyze a document in order to describe an author's purpose, point of view, or how the author's message can be influenced by his or her audience. Thanks for watching, and keep on studying.